Thank you all for coming and to combating cancel culture, why diversity of thought still matters on Indigenous topics. I think this is going to be a great webinar. We have four really interesting speakers. Stuart Regis, who will talk about land acknowledgements. Francis Widdowson, who will talk about Indigenous residential schools. Matthew Garrett, who will talk about looking at how we view Native American culture and not looking at it as just in one perspective to avoid creating stereotypes. And Timothy Ives, who will talk about archaeology and how archaeology can be hijacked by ideologues who reconstruct things to be sacred, which never were. In brief, those are the kind of the overview of the topics. And we will go in that order: Stuart, Francis, Matt, and Tim. We'll also take questions, and if you could please post those in the Q&A as opposed to the chat. That will make it a little easier for me. Just a little background about how we decided to give put this together, this combating cancel culture webinar together. My name is Elizabeth Weiss, and I'm at San Jose State University. And about 2 years ago now, a little less than 2 years ago now, I had a book published on the repatriation and reburial issue with co-author James W. Springer, called Repatriation and Erasing the Past. That led to a flurry of cancellations, including a deplatform talk, a open letter asking the publisher to pull the book or at least not make it open access, and a series of other things that went on in my own university. And so one of the things that happened was my department decided to have an anti-racism speaker series. And so I had asked whether I could have a speaker series that addressed some of the issues that I was concerned with. And I was told no. And then they changed the rules to make it more difficult to get a speaker series. And yet I said, I would follow those rules, and I sent in the proposal for this combating cancel culture webinar along the rules, but I never received a response. I sent a follow-up, and I received no response again. This is probably the first time in my 18 years at San Jose State where I've sent an email to a chair and it was not answered twice. But one of the reasons why I wanted to hold it through my university is also because I would have then been able to provide the speakers with honoraria. And unfortunately, that is not happening. But I would like to suggest that if you are interested in these topics, and if you are concerned about cancel culture, that you consider donating to either one of the organizations like FIRE or Pacific Legal Foundation, who is representing my own case against my university. But also Francis Widdowson has a fundraiser website, and of course donating to the NAS, who were happy to step in and make this happen, even if I couldn't put it on through the university that I work at. Without further ado, let's go ahead and start with Stuart Regis, who's going to talk about land acknowledgements. Thank you.
Okay, let me see if I can share my screen. And I think that looks like it's working for me.
Yes.
So I teach at the University of Washington. I wanted to say up front that these are my opinions and not the opinions of the university. I teach in a school of computer science, so it seems unusual that I'd be involved in something like Indigenous issues. I teach the intro computer science courses, And for several years now, we've been exploring various ways people are trying to get the university to do more about social justice. And in general, I've fought that. I don't like the idea of trying to bring politics into the classroom. And I wish the university would be neutral about these issues. But in general, I've been losing that argument. It was about a year ago today, interesting, that some graffiti appeared on our computer science building. One of them said "Death to America," and in two other places, people had put "land back." So this is kind of this issue, is that there's a feeling, for example, perhaps that the University of Washington doesn't own this land. We should be returning it in some way. So that was an interesting exposure to it. We have a diversity committee in our school that has told us various best practices that they consider for diversity. And one of those is to include an Indigenous land acknowledgement on your syllabus. So I've made up a few slides to be able to talk about this. One of them is just kind of the question of what is a land acknowledgement? And actually, it's very hard to find a good definition of it. I mean, I went to Wikipedia because that's what we turn to for so many things. A land acknowledgement or territorial acknowledgement is a formal, now my Zoom is covering up my thing, is a formal statement that a public event is taking place on land originally inhabited by Indigenous peoples. It's often spoken at the beginning of an event. I noticed that we didn't begin our event with a land acknowledgement. There's a quote I got from the National Museum of the American Indian. Land acknowledgement is a traditional custom that dates back. So the argument is that this is something that Indigenous peoples have done for many centuries. You know, many Native nations and communities today, land acknowledgements are used by Native peoples and non-natives to recognize Indigenous peoples who are the original stewards of the land on which we now live. So there isn't, as I say, this kind of this clear definition of what a land acknowledgement is about. Clearly, it should be about Native tribes that occupied land before, but it's not clear what should be or shouldn't be in such an acknowledgement. It turns out that these things are very unpopular. So I just did a quick look on the web, and it's easy to find lots of articles like this. Land acknowledgements accomplish little. Why Indigenous land acknowledgements are harmful to the public interest. Adam Ellwanger is my one conservative on here. Land acknowledgement statements, the cultural violence of the academic elite. The trouble with land acknowledgements, same topic as same title as my talk. I think Graham Woods is perhaps the most interesting. Many people have quoted this one. It's in the Atlantic, which is a very liberal-leaning publication. Land acknowledgements are just moral exhibitionism. And a recent one on CNN, land acknowledgements are often an empty gesture, some Indigenous people say. So, one of the big questions about land acknowledgements is how useful are they if they aren't paired with some kind of concrete action? In my own writing, the phrase that people have picked up on most from me is that I've described them as performative acts of conformity. So performative in the sense that you're just supposed to say these words. What does it mean to say these words if there's no action you're going to take associated with the words? And conformity in the sense that there's an idea that you're supposed to say a standard thing. So at the University of Washington, we have a land acknowledgement. Let me bring that up. So this is the UW's version of the land acknowledgement. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. This is a quasi-official version. There isn't really an official version, and there's no mandate, so no one is required to use this version, but it's a recommended version, and it's the one that the administration uses. So, and on the page on the university's website where they describe this, they talk about how they developed this in association with local tribes, and they said that when university administrators say this at the beginning of an event, they are acknowledging that the university sits on occupied land. Again, a confusing phrase. What does it mean for the land to be occupied? I mean, if you're saying we occupy it, well, obviously it's occupied. But I think there's an implication, immorally occupied, unjustly occupied, stolen land. They don't quite use that phrase, but it kind of implies that there's some level of guilt or something there. Well, I mentioned here, the idea that everywhere in the United States and Canada we would have land acknowledgements, it kind of takes away the idea that there's a lot of different circumstances, that different areas have different histories to them, different universities will have different histories. One of the suggestions that people make in terms of these land acknowledgements is that you should research the history of your own university. And so I did, actually. I spent some time, found out lots of interesting things. In our case, the tribes signed a treaty with the United States where they sold their claim to the land. That treaty was developed in 1855. Now, you could say it's an evil treaty. There's lots of things to be said. There's a lot of people object to the doctrine of discovery, which was the basis on which the United States dealt with a lot of these tribes. I certainly, we could have a very interesting conversation about that. And I'm very sympathetic to the argument that was an awful policy. But in any event, there was a treaty. It was signed. There's kind of, one of my objections to all of this is that there's this oversimplification that kind of, things get turned into one or two sentences. And it's very clear that any historical interaction with tribes has a lot of nuance to it. There's a lot of different things that you could talk about. So are we we're supposed to honor the tribes, but then do we honor things like slaveholding, which was specifically outlawed in this treaty? Do we honor genocide from one tribe against another? Specifically outlawed. Basically, the treaty said, now you must turn to the United States government to adjudicate your complaints against other tribes. You're not allowed to kill them. Your self-defense is okay, but not genocide. An interesting thing is that you don't need to look any further than Chief Seattle. Read his Wikipedia entry, and you'll find that he signed this treaty, that he committed genocide against a local tribe known as the Chimacum. He had the adult males all murdered, and they took the women and children as slaves. So this is all in the Wikipedia entry for Chief Seattle. So you don't have to look any further than that to find some things that could be of concern. Should a land acknowledgement somehow acknowledge the idea that that this treaty, evil as it might be, brought about some ending certain practices that we don't approve of today? That's kind of to me an open question. And so in Seattle, the original university site was in downtown Seattle, and there were Native tribes who occupied downtown Seattle. So there's kind of an argument you could make that was their land. I think there's a reasonable argument to be made. But the main campus is built on a 350-acre site that was forest. The archives have pictures of this, kind of what it looked like beforehand. In fact, they tell stories about how for years there was an annual ritual here on campus where they would clear stumps, because there were a lot of stumps left over that took a long time to remove, from the university. I mean, this was not a site where there were Native tribes, occupying the space. I think there's a very interesting question about what kind of claim do the Native tribes have? I mean, if you have a few hundred members of your tribe living in downtown Seattle, then do you own downtown Seattle? Do you own King County? Do you own the state of Washington? Do you own North America? I mean, kind of what's the extent of your land claim? And there isn't an easy answer to that. And in fact, the tribes themselves will argue over this. That was my kind of final point, which is there's a question of kind of even what tribes to include. This is a little snippet from a Seattle Times article from earlier this year, that there's a big fight going on about whether or not to include the Duwamish. You might, you probably didn't notice this, but in the land acknowledgement that was on the previous slide that the university came up with, the Duwamish are not mentioned. So, but I can tell you that there are faculty members in my school who do include the Duwamish. This is a political argument, and it's a political argument among the tribes, principally, whether or not the Duwamish should be recognized as a separate tribe or not. So by having a land acknowledgement that mentions the Duwamish, you're taking sides with one group of political activists. By not mentioning it, you're taking sides with a different group of political activists. So there's kind of no way to do a land acknowledgement without getting yourself involved in politics. Now, when I thought this through last fall, it occurred to me that the progressives who've been pushing for these changes on campus had made an error, that there was a vulnerability here. So by encouraging us to have land acknowledgements, they were encouraging us to make political statements. And, what people assumed were your two choices are make a political statement that the progressives would like or say nothing. Those are the two options that people have kind of said would be the obvious options. Well, I realized that there's a third option. I could say something that they don't like. So I came up with my own version of the land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that by the labor theory of property, the Coast Salish people can claim historical ownership of almost none of the land currently occupied by the University of Washington. Now, actually, what I hoped is that when people would hear this, they would chuckle a little bit, that they would say, how clever of Stuart to have figured out a way to challenge the idea that these tribes had a claim to the land. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about John Locke and the second treatise of government, although I am convinced that there has been more discussion of John Locke at the University of Washington as a result of my land acknowledgement than has happened here probably in the last 5 years as a result of courses that students take. So that of course, is not viewed favorably, even though I think it's a good thing to be talking about these things. I mean, I personally have kind of different ideas about land, but my ideas are odd enough that I couldn't express them in 1 or 2 sentences. This is a popular theory of John Locke's that when you mix your labor with the land, you come to own the land. And there's lots of issues. There's what's known as the Locke proviso. There's all, there's a lot of things you could say about this, where, the Stuart simplifying. In fact, Jonathan Turley, a constitutional scholar who responded to this, said, hey, I teach Locke to my students. And what I would do is I'd argue with Stuart. I'd kind of tell him, you got Locke wrong. Here's some other parts of what Locke wrote that you can use to say that Stuart's dead wrong. Debate him, don't cancel him, just debate him. It's an interesting debate. But anyway, I'm convinced that the main, they have said, several people at the university have said, this is not appropriate on a computer science syllabus. And my answer is, you're right. It's not appropriate on a computer science syllabus. But then why is the other one appropriate on a computer science syllabus? Why is the progressive version appropriate and not my version? I'd like to get rid of all of them. That would be my preference. And they've said, well, it's not clear that yours is a land acknowledgement. So, I mentioned the tribes and I mentioned the issue of land ownership. I think it constitutes a land acknowledgement, especially when it's such an ambiguous term. But I'm convinced that the great sin that I'm committing is that I did not express a sense of guilt. That's part of what this is all about, is that this is an opportunity for us to express guilt for how Native tribes have been treated in the past. And it might be appropriate to express guilt. I'm not going to defend all of the things that happened. A very complex history, as I said, it would require a lot to try to describe that well. But this is what drove them crazy. The administrators in our department who handled DEI issues said they were horrified. That was the word they used, horrified, when they saw my land acknowledgement. And what I find interesting, you can think somebody's stupid, like someone could be the town idiot, and then you just kind of, you might tell people that, oh, that guy's crazy, don't listen to him. This is different. This is like a witch. This is blasphemy. This is something almost religious, that I violated a sacred idea, that I dared to challenge the idea, that I didn't express appropriate guilt, and I'm so sorry about what has happened in the past. That, I think, is the big crime that they're particularly upset about. So let me tell you what happened. the university retaliated against me. I included this land acknowledgement on my winter syllabus, and they removed the syllabus and then put it back up with a version that had it erased, from the syllabus. They sent an email to my students saying that I had offended, I said something very offensive, and apologizing. They created an alternate course for students to switch to. Mine was a live course. The alternate course had videos, but they were like, if you want to switch, you can take this alternate course. 30% of the students shifted into the alternate course, and they did it again in spring. They created an alternate course. They've started a formal proceeding against me where they say that I violated a policy of the university, that I may be guilty of harassment. And so this is a process that could eventually lead to me being fired. So multiple constitutional scholars have said this is not okay. FIRE, this organization we talked about, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, they changed what the E stands for recently. That used to be E for education, and now it's expression, because they're trying to expand into the broader sphere of all free speech issues, not just at the university. FIRE is a great organization. Any of you who are university people, I'll tell you something to Google. Google FIRE ranking, because they just came out with their rankings of free speech for universities, and you'll find this comes up. Our university, University of Washington, we were at 188 out of 203. So we were almost at the bottom, and we are at the bottom in terms of public schools. We are the lowest rated public university in the country in terms of free speech. Anyway, so FIRE agreed to represent me. We filed a lawsuit. They told me that the investigation against me is on hold. I asked what that means, and they said, we have nothing more to say. It's on hold. They've hired a local law firm and registered 4 different attorneys who are going to be working on this case against me. Let me just let me try to highlight one thing I have on this idea of harassment. I'll end kind of with this idea of what I think is the interesting thing here in terms of my particular case. That they're using this notion of harassment to say that if students hear an idea that offends them, then that could be harm, and that faculty should not be allowed to express such ideas. So that's kind of the core of their argument, is that I'm harming students by saying things that will deeply offend them. The constitutional scholars have pointed out, look, you can have limitations on speech on campus. You could say no land acknowledgements from anyone, for example. That would be something you could do. No political statements on syllabi. That's something you could do. What you can't do is to say that these progressive versions of the land acknowledgement are okay, and this conservative version of the land acknowledgement is to be punished. That's known as viewpoint discrimination. That's a classic free speech violation. That's the basis of the case. I think it's a very simple case in that sense, that it's these 2 different ideas that are battling it out. We'll see how it turns out. It's being pursued in federal court. The University of Washington is required to follow the First Amendment because it's a state-supported school. So I have the First Amendment to kind of fall back on. Frances does not. I've mentioned to her that I hope her case turns out well too, when she doesn't have quite as much legal support as I do in the United States. Maybe I'll just end with a final thought, that what concerns me is that the ability to discuss things, complex issues, in a calm, measured way is going away. That what's happening on university campuses is students and faculty are afraid to express their thoughts about these things. And that's a disaster for us. We have very complex problems to work out. We need to be able to speak honestly and openly with each other about our feelings. And I'm concerned that this direction that the universities are going is putting that in jeopardy. So I think I'll go ahead and end there. Thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you, Stuart. And I did see the question that came up, and as I said earlier, but some people may not have been here yet, is we'll do the questions at the end. But I do have it. I did look at it. Thank you so much. Just as a side, I noticed that the American Anthropological Association has now removed their land acknowledgement statement or suggestions of land acknowledgements, because they say it's harmful to the indigenous, and they have now formed a committee on how to deal with land acknowledgements. So it is a much more complicated issue than just comply or obey, regardless of where your own perspective is on that. Thank you so much. Next, we will hear from Matthew Garrett from Bakersfield Community College.
Thank you. Thanks, Elizabeth, for organizing this, and to the National Association of Scholars for taking on the panel on diversity of thought after university ironically refused to facilitate such a discussion. I'm flattered to join my esteemed colleagues who I have never before met, but I've been reading about you all in the papers, and I'm deeply impressed by your courage and saddened by what you've all had to undergo. But I'm grateful to be part of the discussion, so thanks. In this panel of diverse disciplinary interests, I should clarify that I'm a historian. I publish and teach in Native American history, and I intend to focus my remarks on the narrowing of the band of permissible speak from that perspective. And I'd like to start with a bit of an autobiographical exploration with a few personal stories from my earliest entry into the field of Native American studies, and contrast them with some of the more recent episodes I see in the broader academy and in the field of history and ethnic studies and Native studies in particular. And my anecdotal stories are by no means definitive or a complete survey of the field, but I do hope that they can add in some way to a dialogue about how we can improve Indigenous studies. I should also clarify that none of my experiences that I plan to share today will approach the overt Gestapo-style attempts to censor a book that I know Elizabeth has gone through, nor will I address in any real depth attempts to terminate employment, which I know some of the co-panelists have experienced, and which I too have experienced myself. In full disclosure, I should admit that my biases and sympathies are such that I've also been embroiled in my own campus controversy at my institution, because in short, I questioned some of the campus's funding for some partisan website that was smearing dissenting faculty. And in response to my call for transparency, the campus, the institution, decided to threaten me with termination, and it sort of blossomed into a much larger attempt to mischaracterize me and push me off campus. So I'm very much familiar with cancellation tactics, and those are an unfortunate part of our recent new academy. And so today I'd like to sort of draw attention not to these individual cases, but more the broader themes that sort of create these acute instances, especially in ethnic studies oriented fields, and more specifically in Native American studies. And I'd like to focus on more subtle, but I think deeply impactful efforts to curtail permissible speech and methods and thought. And I'm really concerned about the rise of an unquestionable new orthodoxy that seems to be centered on the old adage, the ends justify the means. I entered my doctoral program more recently, I think 2006. And as a young, naive, fledgling academic, I was excited. I attended the University of Arizona State University, and worked with some wonderful, exceptional scholars there, and was quickly introduced to a graduate student that was 1 year ahead of me in the program and doing similar research. Upon meeting me, she opened our first conversation with the words, "Oh, just what the world needs, another white man studying Indian history." I was taken back, I was confused. I tried to build on common ground, suggesting that we're all seeking truth and understanding, and her patronizing retort was, "Oh, you still believe in truth." Well, I was dumbfounded. I certainly knew of the postmodern critique and how we might use it to pierce through perceived truth. But this strange breed of skepticism had an oddly dogmatic confidence to it. And I later learned that she was an adherent to an increasingly popular methodology in our field, inspired by works like For Indigenous Eyes Only and Decolonizing Methodologies. Such works articulate overt hostility to all things Western, even dismissing non-Indigenous scholars as clumsy and less capable of doing scholarship in Native studies. In retrospect, I see this colleague's actions as attempting to place me in that box, but at the moment I was really just confused by it all. Later that year, I attended the Western History Association's annual conference in Norman, Oklahoma. Much of the focus centered on Native American topics. It hosted its annual luncheon for Native American scholars, who I found to be wonderful and generous and kind. And it included a dinner with an address from our departing president, WHA President Dave Edmonds, who himself was a distinguished scholar of Cherokee descent. In his address, he alluded to a group of Native scholars who earlier that year had launched their own organization. I was unaware of the schism, but his comments suggested that he had played a role in it somehow, but that he grew uncomfortable with its direction. He called on Native scholars to collaborate and contribute to one body of diverse scholarship, but also he expressed concern about more activist-oriented scholarship that sought not only organizational secession, but also ideological superiority. Edmonds warned that scholars demanded that these scholars demanded non-Native scholars ask their permission and adopt their new and sometimes debated standards for Indigenous research. Edmonds said, and I want to quote, "Within the past decade, some Native academics have urged that scholarship conform to a new orthodoxy defined through the rhetoric of post-colonialism. Post-colonial theory can be a valuable tool in exploring the relationship between Indigenous people and the federal government, but it should not be the only tool. It should not monopolize our analyses. We do not need a new cadre of self-appointed gatekeepers." I was shocked by his comments, but it helped me to grasp or begin to grasp the strange sort of terrain war that I seem to have stepped into. In prior years, a faction of Indigenous scholars had pioneered new methods that relied quite heavily on community advocacy and some more speculative theory type models, such as upstreaming and viewpoint epistemology, which more established scholars, especially in history, rejected. This had implications for publications and tenure evaluations, and there were some hurt feelings. In response, some Native scholars forged their own peer-reviewed journals. They produced their own methodology guidebooks and produced and prioritized their own methods and disparaged those who did not comply. These scholars increasingly erected a new academic orthodoxy from which they have steadily colonized the establishment from which they once defected. At its core, this decolonization theory, it asserts that society is a deeply colonized place, colonized by Western ideals, even at a subconscious level. And then as such, it steers our view and creates assumptions and drives our narratives that can obviate and marginalize and erase Indigenous cultures and identities. Therefore, the colonial project must be deconstructed and a liberation of some sort must occur. This theory draws on a variety of well-established and important scholarship: Karl Marx, Frantz Fanon, Albert Memmi, Edward Said, and this scholarship offers a lot of value. This lens helps us to better understand the dehumanizing experience of colonization, cultural erasure, psychological trauma, previously unrecognized power structures that permeate conceptual frameworks that we've just taken for granted, and previously ignored methods of resistance. And when paired with its kissing cousin French postmodernism, it seems to work to bring marginalized narratives back to the center. It does have great value. But let me be clear that with this great value, there's also some limitations. And we need to be able to discuss those limitations without ad hominem attacks and book cancellations and attacks on one another's employment. Because decolonization relies on two premises: one, the postmodern assumption that all relationships are arbitrary power dynamics, and two, the assumption that all these relationships therein are adversarial. Decolonization theory can really only produce one type of narrative, where Native people are resisting the colonizer. All other forms of agency are simply ignored, or they're misrepresented as some form of resistance. And more than that, many of its advocates really have asserted that decolonization is merely the first step in some sort of Indigenous reconstitution where non-Native voices are unwelcome, or unless, of course, they embrace this particular viewpoint and assumptions. Quite a few scholars have criticized this approach, both Native and non-Native, accusing it of outliving its use or maybe never living up to its potential. One Native scholar, Scott Richard Lyons, he said, and I like this quote, he said that post-colonial studies, quote, "do not deconstruct binaries so much as flip the script." That is, rather than building from Said's assertion of two false tropes, the West and the non-West, and then advocating for some sort of fresh new approach, post-colonial studies often embrace the two tropes and only shift moral authority from one to the other. Instead of praising European trope as rational and productive, much of that scholarship praises non-Western tropes as liberated from Western reasoning and in a perpetual state of resistance. Scholars working within Native American history have vanquished Frederick Jackson Turner's narrative that ignored or exoticized Native Americans, but now have adopted a French theory with a remarkably similar new noble savage trope of an indigenous people who are defined by their total rejection of all things Western, from territorial disposition to Enlightenment reasoning and the presumption of truth. And this new noble savage must always, always resist. It must reject everything, constantly. No other behavior or mindset is permitted in the new noble savage. There's no space for in-group diversity or any form of agency other than resistance. So where are the natives who compromise, synchronize, synthesize, adopt, and replicate foreign ideologies and institutions? And is it even possible to discuss Native Americans outside of a power dynamic? Is everything from art to archaeology to be defined by external power structures as defined in French theory? Many texts now write, history texts write, to answer the same sort of question. They'll ask, how did oppressor group X oppress indigenous group Y? And how did indigenous group Y navigate those power structures? This is at times a very appropriate and perhaps even the best narrative, but it cannot be the only narrative, or we rob past actors of their rich stories that color their lives and their choices. Sadly, the predominant thesis for Native American history books for the past couple of decades has been something like a Native American community fought back in ways we previously did not recognize, and though they haven't entirely won, they continue to exist in their own way. This was novel and interesting and new and fresh in the 1990s, but by 2020s, it's kind of becoming a repetitive story, and it's really obviating other more interesting narratives. Decolonization theory has granted us a better sensitivity to systems of oppression and resistance, but it's also perpetuated an assumption that such relations are the only possible narrative, the only power dynamic. I've witnessed in my own niche field the overt misrepresentation of sources, allegedly what James Scott has called the hidden transcript, but one which only an Indigenous scholar baptized in decolonization theory can possibly decipher by ways of select evidence and seemingly blatant misrepresentations to arrive at a preconceived conclusion of resistance, when it may or may not have actually existed with the historical object person under study. It can be a strange sort of mental gymnastics we're observing. Of course, ideologically driven history is not new. The so-called Whig history of the early 20th century twisted the past into a positivist narrative that was focused on the triumph of the West. And then in the late 20th and early 21st century, we've seen the narrative skew in the opposite direction. So this is certainly true in Native American history, where we've seen Native American women contorted and pressed into the service of ideological ends. You can consider the examples of Sacagawea, Toypurina, Rigoberta, to see Indigenous women who were misrepresented to appease an ideological appetite. My concern is not only the current abuse of past actors to serve modern interests, what we typically call presentist bias, but also the strange new mandatory compliance to go along with it. A failure to pledge allegiance to the new bias is now grounds for ridicule or expulsion. When anthropologist David Stoll debunked I, Rigoberta as a fraud narrative advanced only for its appeal to a certain ideological expectation, criticisms fell on Stoll for exposing the fraudulent claims and asserting himself as the, quote, guardian of truth claims, as if the false narrative was equally valid because it was ideologically reaffirming. Many seem willing to believe an objectively false narrative if it affirms ideological ends. Russian novelist and famous dissenter Alexander Solzhenitsyn has supposedly said, "One man who stopped lying could bring down a tyranny." I don't think he was right. Last month, president of the premier historical association tried to raise awareness about this lie mutually agreed upon, and he was quickly silenced. The American Historical Association has operated for over 100 years, and its long list of respected organizational presidents is an undeniable who's who of history, and they have often issued a critical state of the field type of essay or speech of some sort. In mid-August, AHA President James Sweet published a critique of presentism bias in history in the AHA newsletter Perspectives, which the AHA then posted to their Twitter feed as well. Within hours, a frenzied mob, including professional academics, descended upon the work, demanding its cancellation. What was his crime? In the article titled, "Is History History?" he questioned if present-day biases were narrowing the interests and arguments that are advanced as settled history today. He pointed to examples on the political left and the right side of the spectrum, fairly balanced, but that included one target that really struck a nerve. He picked on the 1619 Project, which has been repeatedly lambasted by historians on the left and the right as being error-riddled. Accusations were quickly directed at Dr. Sweet that ranged from professional incompetence to white supremacy. And within 2 days, the AHA shut down their Twitter feed and posted a groveling apology, or a series of apologies, written by Sweet at the top of the article. In part, it reads, "I take full responsibility that it did not convey what I intended, and for the harm that it has caused. I hope to open a conversation on how we do history in the current politically charged environment. Instead, I foreclosed this conversation for many members, causing harm to colleagues, the discipline, and the association. I sincerely regret the way I have alienated some of my Black colleagues and friends. I am deeply sorry in my clumsy efforts to draw attention to methodological flaws in teleological presentism. Once again, I apologize for the damage I have caused to my fellow historians, the discipline, and the AHA." How things have changed since Dave Edmonds' 2007 address, and I can't help but wonder if Dave Edmonds could have survived the cancellation that soon followed for Dr. Sweet, had Dave Edmonds given his comments in the modern climate with the access to Twitter and social media. I find several interesting takeaways, though, from this AHA episode. First, calls for cancellation chiefly relied on ad hominem attacks and never actually addressed his criticisms, his intellectual arguments. Only one respondent I saw even tried to answer the question, is history history? And that was University of Minnesota Associate Professor David Chang, who is a respected scholar and historian in Native Studies. He tweeted a deeply honest reply, quote, "Indigenous historians are way past presentism. We are telling history for Indigenous futures." Let me repeat that. He said, Indigenous historians are way past presentism. We are telling history for Indigenous futures. What does that mean? Is it an admission that presentism has run amok and scholars don't even care? That teleological ends justify the intellectual malpractice? I'm afraid so. At least for some scholars, it certainly seems to. Creating new narratives unbound by traditional standards of truth, logic, empiricism, is not just a troubling fluke that occasionally surfaces, it's a fundamental aspect of the new orthodoxy. In 2005, Yale historian Donald Kagan noted this emerging trend in postmodern scholarship generally. He called its practitioners modern-day sophists, who are less concerned with historical reality or truth than how it can be manipulated to affirm an ideological agenda. Just last year, Duke University Press published a history of slavery that employs, and I quote, critical fabulation, that is the filling in of the past with assumptions based on present day poetry and other contexts. Fiction now serves as nonfiction. Have we come to a place where we so disbelieve truth that critical fabulation or outright fabrication is permissible, even praised as an example of decolonizing our old system? Can we make up whatever we want as long as it proves our current preconceived notions? Perhaps so. That was the lesson of the grievance hoax papers, I think. The other takeaway from our AHA president's experience that stands out to me is the deployment of a disclaimer to distance the AHA from the offending author and allow him to prostrate himself before the masses and affirm the orthodoxy that he challenged. even self-categorizing him as clumsy and an offender of people of color. It doesn't matter that his original argument was reasonable and accurate. All that mattered was that he violated the current sensibilities and had to suffer a public repudiation. Personally, I'm beginning to think of these sorts of disclaimers as the opposite of their intent. I see them as a signal that a work actually might reflect intellectual diversity, so much so that the New Orthodoxy feels the need to deprecate the text in some way. In fact, my last several publications bear such distancing from editors, and while I applaud those editors, their courage to publish dissenting thought that I authored, I cannot help but feel saddened about the terror those editors must feel that they have to, that necessitates some sort of disclaimer to make sure everyone knows that's not what they believe. What a sad state of affairs that the Academy's fallen into, where such a disclaimer might be perceived as necessary, not because the content might be untrue, but because it dares to challenge the prevailing values. The Academy has a serious problem. It's infected by an ideology that has less loyalty to truth than ideological assumptions. But worse than that, it demands allegiance under threat of cancellation. Last month, NYU social psychologist and co-founder of Heterodox Academy, Jonathan Haidt, publicly resigned from his field's largest professional association. His concern was simple. The institution had replaced its fiduciary responsibility, the pursuit of truth, with ideological affirmation. His criticism is very much a problem in ethnic studies and Indigenous studies in particular, where dissent is not only discouraged, as my co-panelists can attest, it's grounds for expulsion. Not even leading scholars and a president of the predominant association can stand up to this new Leviathan. The Academy has turned its back on its core tenets of skepticism and reason and open inquiry, and instead adopted a dogmatic allegiance to a new orthodoxy that justifies itself through self-referential reasoning and a general climate of coercion. We need a robust intellectual community that's able to approach different questions from different perspectives and different methods. We need open discourse, not narrowed vision and predetermined conclusions. Rather than impose unity for the sake of resistance, we need to explore in-group diversity. And most of all, as Dave Edmonds said nearly 15 years ago, we need not to have a new cadre of self-appointed gatekeepers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. Lots in there, and I really like the emphasis on understanding diversity from within a group, and this is one of the things that I've been trying to talk about in my own work for years. And it's one of the things that I think that is sometimes forgotten about presentism, is that the people of the past weren't just this one monolithic group that all had the same thing either. And that diversity of opinions goes back probably right back to when we started thinking about these things, like Neanderthals or even further back. Thank you so much. Now for Frances Widdowson, and I believe she has some, she's going to share a screen too.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And thank you to the National Association of Scholars for taking on this panel. It's very, very important, and I'm struck by how many similarities exist between me and the other two panelists, and probably the third panelist as well. For people who don't know me, I was a professor in the Department of Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies at Mount Royal University. I was hired in 2008 in part as a critic of Indigenous policy. It was known. I had just co-authored a book with Albert Howard called Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry, which was very critical of the existing policy direction. And Mount Royal was a very academic institution at that time, wanted to make a transition to a university from a college, and they were actually quite excited to have this, kind of challenging approach be part of the university. And things have changed a lot. And this is part of the disturbing character of universities, is that we're seeing a corrosion, a terrible corrosion of the academic mandate. So what I wanted to talk about today is my case and how indigenization, this policy of indigenization has impacted it and has resulted in my firing in December 2021. So my case is going to arbitration in January 16th to 27th. It is an incredibly important case. It is the most significant academic freedom case in Canada, probably for the last 20 years, maybe even longer. And I must win my case. If I do not win, universities are over. I can't stress that enough, because my case is completely about speech. It's about speech entirely. It has no complicating factors in it. And in this presentation, I am just going to get into the indigenization aspects. There are other elements to do with what I will call reified postmodernism, which is postmodernism, which was a relativist position in the 60s. Identity politics became involved, and then it became a totalitarian, had a totalitarian dynamic, which was subjective, like it relies on subjectivity and imposes that subjectivity on everyone. And in terms of indigenization, just so people know what indigenization is a national policy that's sweeping universities in Canada. It's about infusing all aspects of Indigenous culture into the university. Some of these things are innocuous because they're like art, bringing in Indigenous artwork and so on. But it has a lot of very disturbing characteristics, such as incorporating what's called Indigenous ways of knowing into the curriculum. And Indigenous ways of knowing are in many ways opposed to the scientific method, and are opposed to disputation, the process of disputation and critical thinking, and are definitely opposed to the university as the pursuit of a universal truth. Indigenization, I should also mention, is different than what's called now decolonization, which is an even worse initiative, which is gathering steam now, which is about removing elements which are perceived to be opposed to the political aspirations of Indigenous groups. So basically removing things out of libraries, which Indigenous groups take issue with. So that's an even worse initiative, but indigenization was how it all started. So in terms of just giving a sense of what I wanted to talk about today, first of all, I want to show you what Mount Royal was doing with respect to indigenization, and then talk very briefly about why I was canceled, the reasons that were given, which were misleading, because they were, and it's similar to what Stuart mentioned, which was harassment. Like harassment is kind of a weapon of reified postmodernism, but people think harassment, like that you're haranguing someone in the hallways and berating them and preventing them from pursuing their workplace goals. You have a position of power over someone else. That's not what is meant by harassment in today's day and age. It is, as Stuart was mentioning, saying something that's offensive, that a member of a group, a protected group, doesn't like, that kind of thing. And then I have 3 examples of what was considered to be harassment and toxicity, which resulted in my firing, which all relate to indigenization. And then I just wanted to conclude with a talk about politicization of the university, because indigenization is part of the politicization. It's wider than indigenization, but indigenization in Canada, at least, is a major aspect of university politicization. So, Indigenous Strategic Plan. And so that's kind of funny. Bruce Gilley, who I'm not sure if he's in the audience, but he wrote a very good piece on my case. He mentioned that the plan was to remove Francis Whittleson out of the university, and they did it. 2021, the plan's over. Your Whittleson is gone. Anyway, it has these 5 goals as part of indigenization. And you can see I've just highlighted some of the kinds of phrases which are resulting in cancellation. They sound very innocuous, and there's three words I think that are prominent there: respect, welcoming, relationships. So that's kind of stressed, and people say, what could be wrong with that? Don't we want a respectful kind of institution? Well, the thing is that respect is, you have to kind of defer to whatever claim is being made, and if you critically analyze anything, there's going to be outrage expressed. Welcoming means if you say something that is offensive to a member of a protected group, you should be pushed out. So welcoming is just welcoming for certain perspectives. And then the relationship building is that they're trying to draw connections with various Indigenous organizations. And if an Indigenous organization gets upset at what you're saying, there's going to be pressure put on the university to cancel you. So all those kinds of elements are very, very strong here. And that was a major problem in terms of my case. This was creating a poisonous environment for me, because if I would criticize anything to do with indigenization, I would have this kind of pushback and kind of, claims that, why is Frances Whittleson here? Why doesn't she go get a job somewhere else if she doesn't like indigenization? And people said originally you can dissent, but you could sort of see the climate that was being created, which was very hostile to critical thinking and open inquiry and these sorts of major aspects of the academic environment. Okay, so that was what indigenization was all about. Then we have the cancellation. So for people who are interested in my case, there's been a website that's been developed about it. It has more information about it, and this actual presentation was posted onto that website, www.wokeacademy.info. And there's, I believe now, 14 episodes about my case that are on there in the Frances Whittleson firing section. But these three are the main ones that are from my termination letter from Mount Royal President Tim Raleigh. And the second one, which is about the frivolousness and vexatiousness, that makes things too complicated. But the number 1 and number 3 are essentially what I'm going to be talking about today, which is 1, harassment. So a violation of the harassment policy, and code of conduct has got similarities to that. And then 3rd, toxicity. So toxic work environment. So when people see those things, they go, oh, well, it's a good thing she's gone. She's harassing, she's pushing people into water fountains, she's accosting them in the hallway, she's doing all these things, and she's just creating this general kind of, horrible environment for everyone there. And there's a couple of misleading things that have happened with respect to this. One is that and this is the last part is in terms of the but is something that was put forward by an investigator. So this is one of the investigators. Is that first of all my the reasons why I was fired have to do with social media, my posts on social media. Nothing was workplace at all. It was all social media. Now, of course, they're trying to claim that social media is workplace. So that's going to be a big part of the case. And I was enduring people defaming me on social media for 4 years at Mount Royal, telling administrators about it, and everyone was giving me the impression that social media wasn't a workplace area. So that's going to be a major area of discussion. But then you'll see there's an interesting kind of slippage that happens, which is demeaning people and then the viewpoints that they have. And what the slippage is that they claim that since you're quote unquote demeaning, which is being critical of a viewpoint, that means that you're demeaning the person themselves. So that's the slippage. And basically I was, I was opposing various ideas that were being put forward on social media. And that was seen as being grounds for termination. And there's 3 kinds of areas where this happened. These, what they considered to be quote unquote demeaning viewpoints. The first one was the idea that Indigenous science is not science. So this was an allegation that was made in one of the investigations that I was subjected to. It was claimed that I had said at a talk that Indigenous science was not science. I had recorded what I said, fortunately. So it was found that what this person was claiming was not true, but that didn't matter. Like, it didn't do anything to diminish her credibility at all. But I was not found to be guilty of harassment in that instance. The question, though, is that even if I had said that Indigenous science is not science, which means if you put an ethnic adjective in front of science, it means it doesn't have a universal character anymore. Therefore, its scientific character is in question. This kind of claim that was made led me to ask a question at Arts Faculty Council, where someone was saying that Indigenous scholars had left Mount Royal because they felt unsafe. So I asked a question, is saying that Indigenous science is not science, because that was what the claim was in this investigation, is that an example of Indigenous scholars not feeling unsafe? Is that possibly what could be making them say they feel unsafe? At this meeting, I was attacked by 7 faculty members, and as a result of that, they had to disable the chat function. But that was a reason given for my firing, was that and they were blaming me, presumably because I'd asked this question about, does saying that Indigenous science is not science, is that something that makes Indigenous scholars feel unsafe? Anyway, I have a recording of that meeting, and so we will see whether, people think that it was me who was the problem in that particular instance. But just asking the question is seen as a huge difficulty in this current climate at various universities across Canada. So that's the first example. Second example, which is very, very important right now, and Elizabeth mentioned this, this is this idea of residential school denialism, which is trying to equate people who are questioning whether the residential schools were genocidal. It's trying to equate people who are doing that with Holocaust deniers. That's kind of what's going on. The chief architect of these arguments is Sean Carlton, who is a historian from University of Manitoba, and he considers himself to be a residential school denialism expert. So he's made himself an expert in this area, and he goes around and instructs people as to how to challenge denialism and so on. Anyway, residential schools, research on them is a major area of my research. I'm working currently with a group of about 18 other researchers. The most significant is Nina Green, who is an IF Stone figure, who is digging up all sorts of information on the residential schools. Anyway, so I was involved in this since 2017, trying to offer some criticisms of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. And after that, there started to be this pressure that you must accept that the residential schools were genocidal and provided no benefits. And this resulted in a student, when I was making this claim, a student complaining to the president about how could I be saying these things, because, and you'll see the highlighted version, that how could I not recognize that the residential schools were harmful to Indigenous people and deny that genocide occurred? And then here's the kicker: by her stating this, she is going against MR's mission of decolonization and indigenization. So that's sort of the problem, is that kind of pressure that's on. And by having that Indigenous strategic plan, it's opening me up to these kinds of complaints. Then we had a motion a few days later in General Faculty's Council, which said that yes, genocide was done to Indigenous people. And this led an activist group, supposedly student-led group on campus, to say, hopefully this means that genocide denial will no longer be allowed at Mount Royal. And then in June 14th, 2021, so over a year ago now, but one of my colleagues said he supported academic freedom, but if you say there's benefits to the residential schools, you should be fired. So that's academic freedom, yes, but saying the residential schools have benefits, no. Anyway, these kinds of things were resulted in a couple of points in the termination letter. And one of them was a press release, which I'll show you shortly, from the Students Association, and also all the complaints that they were given. So if students complain about you, you should be fired. And that's why my case is so important, because you can imagine many instances where you say something unpopular or people who disagree with the students complain. But why, if students complain, should professors be fired? Is that the new standard? So that is very disturbing, that kind of development. And then the third, which was my most unorthodox approach to this ongoing mob that was forming. So a mob started to form for another reason, which I'm not going to get into, my defense of the journalist Wendy Mesley for referring to the book title, White Niggers of America. I was defending her, and a mob formed to try to get me fired for that. And because I found everyone so irrational about this, I turned my Twitter account into a satirical character called Francis McGrath, who was modeled on Andrew Doyle's character, Titania McGrath. And I started to satirize the attempts of this mob to get me fired. And I had some other things which were like I was kind of parroting this idea, this comparison between the Holocaust and the residential schools. That's what I was doing, because I think that's a ridiculous comparison. Like Auschwitz is not the same as the Kamloops Indian residential schools. They're claiming that this mass grave of 215 children was found. In fact, what's happened is there were 215 soil disturbances found on the GPR. What hasn't been discounted is that there was a septic system put in place in 1925, which would have had lots of digging and septic tiles put in. We can't see the report, so we can't see whether that was kind of considered when those 215 soil disturbances were found. Anyway, that seems to be highly unlikely that's the case. So, you know, I was trying to draw attention how this is ridiculous. And the residential schools were about trying to provide education. They weren't about extermination of people. And then, of course, the evidence-based. There's all sorts of claims now that if you demand evidence, you're somehow a white supremacist. And say so. And some of my colleagues are faculty association. It's the faculty association had a white supremacy culture workshop that they were holding. So I was making fun of this, that they were saying that, you know, demanding evidence is a part of white supremacy culture, you know, critical thinking, white supremacy culture, which I thought was hilarious. And I was just parroting that. Both of those tweets were found to be creating a toxic workplace. They were both found to be doing that, which was on Twitter. It was not in the workplace at all. And then the final thing was the Students Association. They put out a press release on July 13th, 2021, you know, denouncing me for deriding the unmarked graves of Indigenous children. Well, I wasn't deriding the unmarked graves, and I was parroting this idea that soil anomalies were somehow indications of genocide. You know, so, and I was going after what I consider to be the rent seekers, people who are demanding transfers on the basis of these kinds of fabricated types of what they call discoveries, which are not discoveries at all. So there's like a lot of misunderstanding. And then the Holocaust residential schools, the thing I was parroting about that was seen as me somehow saying the Holocaust, I was downplaying the Holocaust. I was somehow denying, it's like, no, I'm actually criticizing people for making the comparison, because that is not understanding the huge atrocity of the Holocaust, to compare the Holocaust to the Kamloops Indian residential school. So anyway, these were all part of the investigations that went on. And then in terms of concluding remarks, you know, I think that what's occurring here with the Indigenization initiative is part of university politicization. So the universities now, instead of providing a forum for different viewpoints to come together and debate and discuss and examine things critically, there's a political position that's declared. And what that's doing is it's telling you to get on board. with that position, and Indigenization was doing that. So it's like, this is our position. And initially it was, you can dissent, but this is sort of they pretended it was the general position. But now it is, if you don't get on board with it, you're going to be pushed out. You're going to be canceled, is basically the situation. And this very much, the last presenter was mentioning the Jonathan Haidt, his situation. This is very much what we're talking about here, is that the university, it needs to be a truth-seeking institution. That has to be its highest value. We can have other values at the university, but they cannot conflict with this telos, which is the main value. And what's happening with things like indigenization is that there is a conflict, and it's in fact indigenization, which is basically undermining the truth-seeking telos. And then finally, another kind of area that I think is very, very important comes from Mark Mercer, who's the president of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. And I'm a board member of this organization, very, very important academic freedom organization in Canada, actually a sister organization to the National Association of Scholars. And when Mercer has identified, and this was in the National Post in 2018, that one of the problems with indigenization is that it demands what he calls a culture of celebration, that you have to kind of celebrate identities as opposed to disputing claims, holding claims up to analysis. And in indigenization, there's no disputation. It's all, you've got to respect, you've got to value, all these sorts of things. And I think that these two things, this kind of destruction of the telos, truth-seeking telos, and also demanding celebration, are two of the most significant problems that we're facing in the university. And the indigenization is a major element of both destroying the telos and also demanding celebration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frances. That was great. I predict, and maybe I'll be completely wrong, but I predict that there will be never an excavation to determine whether the ground penetrating radar is any grave or is just disturbed earth. I've been making this prediction for a little while now, a couple of years now, but that's my prediction.
And I should mention that we don't even need to do that. They have not even released the ground penetrating radar report. So that they're keeping that secret. So that's the first demand, is why not release the report so it can be looked at by outside experts?
Yeah, we know why. Okay, thank you so much. Tim Ives is our last speaker.
Okay. I'm gonna try to share my screen here. So I think I just hit that share screen button. Click share, and from beginning. All right, can everyone see that? Okay. All right, here I go. All right, I'm not a member of the National Association of Scholars. My name is Tim Ives. And if anyone ever characterized me as a scholar, I would probably laugh. So I am all the more grateful to be participating in this important event. In this talk, I'll provide a little insight into a cancel culture situation on the New England scene. I'm referring to a wildly inaccurate revision of the region's history that has enjoyed the protection of cancel culture and has been growing in popularity for years. In fact, it has become the centerpiece of a bona fide social movement, replete with activists, websites, public campaigns, and legal confrontations. As I see it, this movement owes much of its success to the silence of otherwise reasonable people who are afraid to criticize it because they're afraid of being cast as racist. It is also defended by a subset of academic and professional defenders whose rhetoric registers allyship towards Native Americans while mobilizing racial paranoia among would-be critics. Between this self-censoring and this perimeter defense, this movement has enjoyed a free pass from public criticism. Well, at least until I took a sustained interest in it. I've learned a lot in the process, but first a trigger warning is in order. much of the following information will sound so crazy that you will wonder if I just made it up. Except for some of my pithy commentary, this is all extremely real and verifiable. The cancel culture barrier that I am discussing surrounds the ceremonial stone landscape movement, an ostensibly decolonial movement based out of the American Northeast. Its central claim is that many, if not most, of the stone heaps, walls, and other structures scattered about the region's secondary forests are not vestiges of abandoned 19th century farmsteads, as most have thought since those farmsteads were abandoned. Rather, this movement claims that such stonework actually represents ancient indigenous ceremonial constructions that require extraordinary protection from the ravages of settler colonial development. It insists that stonework throughout the region represents an undiscovered country, a massive and neglected sacred landscape that was already there before European colonists arrived. But as decolonial as this claim may sound, anyone looking into its intellectual pedigree will recognize something interesting, that the theory and spirit of this movement was developed by a pair of white male antiquarians well over a decade before Native American cultural representatives were invited to adopt it as traditional tribal knowledge. Yes, New England antiquarians. To provide some background, for much of the 20th century, antiquarians enjoyed a speculative tradition of theorizing that much of the region's presumably mysterious stonework was created by pre-Columbian transoceanic visitors such as Chaldee monks, Norse explorers, or Phoenician traders. And they formed at least 3 societies to pursue and share their ideas. But many antiquarians grew tired of that old script by the 1980s. So 2 of them flipped it in their 1989 book, Manitou, Sacred Landscape of New England's Native Civilization. They argued that Native Americans were responsible for much of the same phenomena formerly attributed to Vikings and such. They laid out the principles that comprise today's ceremonial stone landscape theory. 1, most of the dry-laid stonework in New England's contemporary forests is pre-colonial, astronomically oriented, ritual landscape architecture. Under the protection, number 2, under the protection of historically obscure Native Americans and white sympathizers, much of this stonework secretly survived colonial-era landscape abuses. 3, today these truths are only evident to intuitively perceptive individuals who reject mainstream historical and archaeological dogma. So this book, Manitou, provided antiquarians with a fresh new conspiracy theory to pursue, one that was particularly seductive to white practitioners. They could identify alleged ceremonial stone phenomena, advocate for their preservation, and feel that they've corrected some of America's racist history along the way. Several antiquarians pursued Manitou's vision through the 1990s, publishing articles and giving talks here and there, but they gained little traction with the general public, neither of whom were interested in learning about hypothetical Native American spirituality from older middle-class whites armed with a devastating surplus of time and imagination. But a pragmatic handful of antiquarians recognized the potential power of this vision and recognized that Native American endorsement might unlock it for them. In addition to wanting to stop a particular affordable housing development, they wanted their ideas to be legitimized, so they reached out to a handful of Native Americans. The ceremonial stone landscape movement began exactly 19 years ago. In 2003, when a persistent handful of antiquarians reached out to and eventually converted a handful of Native American cultural authorities. Apparently, this conversion involved several group visits to stone landscape sites and discussions of the book Manitou. The precepts of Manitou were reconfigured as traditional tribal knowledge, and the Native American Congress, known as the United South and Eastern Tribes, legitimized the ceremonial stone landscape concept as an indigenous phenomenon in 2 resolutions. But the chairperson of that organization also went on record telling an audience of antiquarians, "We did not know about these things, you showed us the way." Nonetheless, the interpretation and preservation of presumably sacred ceremonial stone phenomena become a morally fashionable decolonial program that moved rapidly into the Overton window. The political power of this new vision was tested by a small group of Native American representatives and antiquarian advisors in 2005, when they publicly challenged that affordable housing development and got the municipality to redraw plans to protect the ceremonial stone landscape. Antiquarians saw their ideas move from the purely theoretical realm, where they carried no force, to the very real political realm, where they had force, Before, archaeologists who dismissed their ideas could be accused of closed-mindedness, but now they could be accused of racism. There would be more such challenges to come, usually with the Native Americans taking the political lead, with antiquarian advisors and volunteers in tow. Agency after agency would make good faith efforts to accommodate these claims, if only to avoid being seen as anything less than trusting and sympathetic toward Native American representatives. The following organizations have funded and or conceptually embraced the ceremonial stone landscape movement. As you can see, several federal and municipal agencies are included on this list. The towns of Hopkinton and Smithfield, Rhode Island have included language in their comprehensive plans, committing themselves to ceremonial stone landscape recognition and preservation. The Massachusetts Cultural Council promoted a major series of public education events throughout their state. The National Trust for Historic Preservation funded a tribally oriented ceremonial stone landscape training program, the nature of which remains unknown to outsiders. My former employer, the Rhode Island Historical Preservation and Heritage Commission, made a $10,000 grant of taxpayer-derived money for a ceremonial stone landscape survey of a property that consisted of an abandoned 19th century farmstead. Despite being the state archaeologist, I was not invited to review or comment on that report by our state historic preservation officer, who was, at the time, unambiguously involved with the movement and being hailed as one of its champions. Public education tours are held in various parts of New England and New York State. If you visit, you might be able to take a tour of a local ceremonial stone landscape. And if not, you could probably find an upcoming lecture in some nearby town. Ceremonial stone landscapes have become a book genre. Though Native Americans are not writing or producing these books, they're all written by enlightened settler colonists. Ceremonial stone landscape themed websites have proliferated, though I am not aware of any being authored by tribal people. And the public is consuming such information as posted by the premier blogger, Dr. Peter Waxman, who wrote, "Google gets its own ideas baked into its own definition of relevance. In 11 years of rock piles blogging has convinced Google this is the source of information about such things. No conventional wisdom or academic viewpoint will ever catch up. So far as the internet is concerned, rock piles are antiquities left by Native Americans for ceremonial purposes. It says so on the Google." He is absolutely correct. In October of 2018, his blog ranked 26 on FeedSpot's top 40 New England blogs and websites to follow in 2019. Two religious groups have boiled out of this activist cauldron. The syncretic spiritualists of the Northeast declared their existence in a lawsuit aimed at stopping a solar farm. They claim their lack of access to ceremonial stones may or may not exist on the solar farm property and unspecified properties throughout town could cause negative health effects that have been medically linked to syndromes that can include death. And then we have the US pagans. Suggesting historical roots in European megalithic paganism, the US pagans are described as a transplanted people who spiritually revere indigenous stonework because they must come to terms with the fact that they are living uninvited on indigenous lands. These self-styled transatlantic transplants hope to, quote, "find a way to relate to the land that avoids cultural appropriation," unquote. A spokesperson has proposed that, quote, "political justice requires that US pagans, being non-indigenous, somehow attempt to receive permission or recognition from indigenous Americans," unquote, to honor their stonework. Folks, I am not capable of thinking up any satire that could stand up to such flamboyantly self-defeating material. Of course, the movement sees itself as virtuous, with its professed intentions being to inflate spirit energy, to preserve spirit energies of places, to maintain balance with our Earth Mother, to rehabilitate sacred indigenous knowledge, to challenge settler colonial development, and to promote a new history to replace mainstream history, which is presumably composed of myths and lies. While these certainly sound like positive intentions, the problem is the real world results of this program have been messy and in several ways harmful to indigenous people and or the settler colonial society in which they exist. I can testify that the movement aims to shame critics into silence, which has the effect of publicly suppressing intellectual diversity. Dr. Curtis Hoffman writes that my research is merely an attempt to fabricate a forgotten 18th century use for stone heaps. That's his way of calling me a fraud. One antiquarian blogger tries to whip up moral outrage against me periodically, inventing clever names like Dr. Hives and Snakehead. He must be outsourcing his insults to a 5th grade bully, I presume. Other brave online personalities have called me such things as mean, condescending, heartless, and disgusting. One likened my writings to attempted ethnic cleansings and suggested I be confined to an isolation booth to protect society from my cultural hatred. And yet another individual went so far as to declare that people like Mr. Ives are the ones continuing the genocide on my people. So, in short, I've been slandered as a lying, racist, anti-Indian, genocidal Nazi for my intellectual dissent. As you can see, I am devastated beyond measure. They never even asked me for my pronouns. But seriously, the prospect of this sort of thing is terrifying enough to archaeologists that most simply choose to self-censor. Who wants to face that? The movement has a talent for transubstantiating any discussion about managing an alleged ceremonial stone landscape into a public racial ultimatum. What you are seeing is a glimpse of what the movement's so-called peace, balance, and harmony can look like when it rolls into town. Inflating racial paranoia has been a key political strategy for ceremonial stone landscape activism since it began. After all, who wants to stand up in a municipal meeting and openly disagree with sacred stone claims when they know they'll be regarded as racist by activists who are exquisitely sensitive to any form of disagreement? It is not uncommon today for rural white landowners to discover presumably sacred stone formations on abutting property, and to do so immediately after that property has become slated for development. Being spontaneously concerned about indigenous spirituality, which presumably involves mysterious ceremonies in the forest, they try to involve whatever Native American activists they can find. And of course, the ceremonial stone landscape paradigm is centered on the idea that spiritually enlightened whites such as themselves are special allies of Native Americans. In my last job as Rhode Island state archaeologist, I was regularly contacted by landowners seeking to initiate these campaigns. An insider refers to the strategy as the Indian rock defense. I'm not sure which is a greater human indignity: settler colonists self-righteously imploring local Native Americans to become political foot soldiers in their petty land battles, or the fact that some Native Americans step into those roles so enthusiastically. But that's the theater that has taken shape in New England. As I see it, this movement intellectually colonizes Native Americans in the here and now. Nothing can change the fact that this young movement is based on a conspiracy theory published by a pair of antiquarians in 1989, or that their theory only gained political traction after certain representatives endorsed it in 2003 and made it ostensibly decolonial. As we all know, settler colonists have put centuries of effort into converting local Native Americans to Christianity. But today, within this movement, we are witnessing settler colonists endeavoring to convert Native Americans back to a belief system that they imagined was destroyed by their ancestors. I'm amazed that no one is willing to call out this creepy operation for what it is, colonialism, and that no one is willing to admit that it is still possible for Native American representatives to aid and abet this process. These doctoral degree holding archaeologists have promoted the principles of ceremonial stone landscape theory in their writing and/or public presentations. I find this astonishing. I also find it ironic because they are promoting a vision that was originally and explicitly developed to undermine their own field. I think they've taken quite a gamble, and I wonder how their work will be looked back at in 20 years. Curiously, a number of scholars and professional archaeologists seem to suggest that one of the greatest barriers to the flourishing of the ceremonial stone landscape claims is not problems with theory or evidence, but racially ignorant or insensitive attitudes among their peers. To me, they seem to assume the role of symbolic defenders of Native Americans. First, consider the commentary from a fellow archaeologist, which he made on film to a tribal official in regard to the age of a stone pile feature. You'll never convince redneck archaeologists that that date's associated with that thing, Maybe you don't need to, because the number of redneck archaeologists, I think, is getting smaller and smaller. His statement suggests that the real problem they face is not evidentiary or theoretical, but a fading generation of racially biased archaeologists. Another scholar would seem to defend potential ceremonial claims by taking a critical posture towards potentially skeptical contract archaeologists, who he claims seek, quote, comfort in the practical, perhaps safer interpretation of all stone features as related to white farming practices, unquote, aiming at purification to clear the land for more developments. In other words, he appears to criticize professional archaeologists for finding so much of the farm ruins that we would otherwise expect them to find in the woods of New England, and seems to cast that as an outcome, some sort of form of systemic racism rather than common sense. Or consider the statement from a history professor: the very questioning of ceremonial stone landscape claims can be seen as a retrenchment of anti-tribal ways of thinking and seeing. While I presume the statement's message was intended to carry positive value, that value does not include clearing a path for critical discussion of ceremonial stone landscape claims. On the contrary, it drops a roadblock of racial anxiety in the way of any non-Indian who might have an important and potentially productive question to ask. Some archaeologists suggest that we begin censoring the very language we use towards stone things in the woods. For example, 2 contract archaeologists have pledged to avoid using terms like cairn or chamber in their research according to their disrespectful, racist, or imperialist undertones. Or consider this quote from another archaeologist: over the past 350 years, Europeans have systematically separated Native Americans of northeastern North America from their places of religious significance and ceremony. Disenfranchisement has taken the form of archaeological identification of Aboriginal stone features as farmers' piles and root cellars. I think her point is that if you run across what appears to be a root cellar or a farmer's pile, you are morally obligated not to call them those things to begin with, on the off chance that you are wrong. So is it little wonder that archaeologists are by and large refuse to say anything critical whatsoever about the ceremonial stone landscape movement? If there's a heap of stones in the woods that activists have identified and an archaeologist is called in for a critical opinion, these are the kind of questions running through their heads. And I know this to be the case because I know a lot of the people involved. Will I be called racist? Will I be branded anti-tribal? How can I be honest without triggering these people? And this is not entirely serious. Will the syncretic spiritualists sue me? I don't know, maybe they will. Surely it is no accident that this movement's promoters generate this political atmosphere. It seems to be the perfect atmosphere for keeping skeptical archaeologists out of the conversation and protecting its narrative from having any contact with outside criticism or inconvenient information. This movement's slogan is, let the landscape speak, but it could just as well be, let don't anyone else speak. Sometimes I find it difficult to believe this phenomenon is taking place in 21st century New England, which is one of the most highly educated regions on planet Earth. For centuries, Western civilization has relied on New England intellectuals to push socially progressive agendas in so many important areas: abolition, women's suffrage, child labor, mental health care, you name it. We have a lot to be proud of, but ceremonial stone landscape ideology, are we being smart here? Is this really socially progressive? If you're interested in learning more, check out my book, Stones of Contention. I'm sure you'll find the stones are of minor interest compared to the drama that a diverse cast of characters has managed to generate around them. Though in addition to my lively social criticism, the book also synthesizes my decade of original research into the history and archaeology of the stone structures. There's something for everyone in here. Affording full credit to Gad Sad for the analogy, I consider this book an inoculation against the mind virus of ceremonial stone landscape ideology. However, I doubt reading it would benefit the already infected. I have never heard of even one true believer on the scene ever deciding that they are fundamentally wrong. Second to last slide. And one more thing, my book was originally accepted for publication in the planned Problems of Anti-Colonialism series. The series, co-edited by a National Association of Scholars board member, Bruce Gilley, was signed by a prominent publisher, which abruptly dropped it after a Change.org petition branded it a white nationalist project. The fact that the other co-editor, Eric Liu, was a United Democratic Front activist who put his very life on the line, Pursuing the defeat of South Africa's apartheid regime was conveniently overlooked by this cancel mob's white nationalist diagnosis. Next, the series was taken on by a second publisher who abruptly dumped it when the cancel mob resurfaced. The white nationalist label continued to stick, even though its growing international editorial board included Doctors Fuad Mami and Wanjiru Nyaoya, neither of whom are white nationalists. The lesson here is that far-left academics have no problem using shame and patently false accusations as an insurgent methodology to prevent decolonial theory from facing unwanted questions. As if decolonialism does not have a robust record of triggering unanticipated and often tragic second-order effects on the populations it claims to benefit. In any case, I refuse to allow my book to remain grounded as a matter of principle, so I signed with New English Review Press, who publish it as a standalone trade book. Now it's out there for everyone to read, and no one's going to cancel it. Fly free, stones of contention, fly free. Thank you. All right, I'm going to end screen sharing.
Thank you so much for that, Tim. I was one of the people that Bruce asked to review the book way early on when it had just gotten to Anthem, and it's a great read. It's a fun read, even if you're not really, even if you don't know about archaeology. I didn't know about the ceremonial stone landscape debate before I picked up the book. And I really enjoyed it, so I definitely recommend it. We have some questions, so let me go ahead and get to those. The first one's for Stuart, and it's, in your opinion, are land acknowledgements primarily done to appease Indigenous tribes who have experienced genocide on a massive scale, or are they appealing to the consciousness of progressives, setting aside the reproach for progressives and cancel culture? Is it possible that the remnants of Indigenous societies might deserve some sort of acknowledgement?
Well, they took off in Canada after this 2015 report from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what I would say is that the driving force is shame, a sense of shame, and people are looking for something they can do to alleviate their shame. And so I think that land acknowledgements, the crazy thing is that the only people who really benefit from them are the people who say the words, because it makes them feel better about themselves, that they've done something that to address this issue. I don't know if the chat's available to everybody, but I'm going to put a URL in the chat. I'll also tell you how you can get there if chat isn't available. Again, from Canada, there's Baroness von Sketch is this female comedy troupe, fantastic group. They have an amazing 2-minute thing on land acknowledgements that you should watch when we finish this thing. If you don't see the chat, you just look up land acknowledgement skit, and it will come up as the first entry there. It is brilliant. It basically, shows the hypocrisy of people who want to feel better by making this land acknowledgement. Some of the harshest critics have been Indigenous folks. So this is something from the woke folks, to try to alleviate their guilt.
Great, thank you. The next is not a question, but just a comment from Bruce Gilly. Says, thanks for being a hero. Why don't more faculty stand up for free speech? Fear? Anybody want to mention anything about the aspect of fear?
I think that's one of the factors, but there's also other factors. Opportunism is a big one. So it's not going to be a career enhancing type of way of responding. And so I think that, but certainly I know several people, and as well the secrecy. That's the other thing that's very annoying, is universities with their institutional power really put down the hammer on people who are going through these kinds of ordeals. And you really need to be as public as you can so that people know what's happened. In my case, I know there's probably, because of what Mount Royal has implied, that I was this kind of horrible person going around, doing all these terrible things to Indigenous and people of color on campus when it had nothing to do with anything on campus at all. So there's a variety of factors, but fear is definitely one of them.
Another comment, not a question, a comment from John Palmer about land acknowledgements. He says, I acknowledge that my own land acknowledgement statement. I acknowledge that the land I live on was stolen back and forth innumerable times in bloody wars about hunting, trapping, fishing, and breeding rights by early pre-European people, and that it was sold by the chief of the Chippewas, last pre-European owners, to the British. I also acknowledge that the land on which most of the University of Western Ontario is situated was previously owned by the London Hunt and Country Club. So that would be his land acknowledgement, covering both the natives who were there, but also the previous owners of there. You could see that you could have some real fun with land acknowledgements if it wasn't, if people didn't take it so harshly.
I think it would be fun to try to create a movement where we get people to do a lot of crazy land acknowledgements. I told our local Heterodox Academy group that we should show that Baroness von Sketch skit on our first class and say that's what we think about land acknowledgements, and see if they would try to get us fired for showing a comedy skit.
I'm definitely going to be checking that out after this. William McNally has a question. Is there any limit to the claim of harassment in a university? How do we limit workplace harassment to exclude idea harassment? I think, Francis, you probably have some thoughts on this.
Yes, and this is a major problem that the courts kind of have to decide about this, what the limits are going to be. And right now, the important thing is you have to show impact, that there's been some impact on someone's ability to pursue their workplace goals. And it can't just be subjective. So first of all, the objective standard. So for example, in one of my cases, doesn't have to do with indigenization, but has to do with trans activism. I had one tweet that satirized the idea of misgendering fatigue and the LGBTQ initialism. So I satirized that. That was found to violate 3 policies and 2 laws. 2 pieces of legislation. But any kind of objective standard, how could a trans activist looking at that, how would that possibly affect their ability to pursue their workplace goals? It could only be some kind of extreme anxiety type of disorder that someone had, that anything that's said makes them upset and so on. So I think the reasonable person standard, which I realize has some problems with it, but also impact on and power relationships as well. Usually harassment used to be, if you're a supervisor and you're having control over someone else in the workplace, that would come into it. But now it's just, you say something on your social media accounts that someone doesn't like, and then the universities are saying that they're harassment. So the courts, that's why we need arbitration decisions, court decisions saying, no, all these kinds of claims, this is outside of it. The problem is that often these things don't go that far, and you have terribly oppressive actions that occur to faculty members just by being dragged through these processes. It's a big problem.
Anybody else want to?
Greg Lukianov, who's the president of FIRE, has talked about there was the first era of political correctness in the late 80s and early 90s. Those of us who were around may remember that there were a lot of universities who passed hate speech limitations, and almost all of them were struck down by courts. So, the feeling of the folks at FIRE is that we're just going through this again. We're going to have to go through it all over again and get these things struck down. I talked to a bunch of graduate students in our department who are part of the DEI stuff, and they all think that hate speech is illegal. And I don't know why they got that impression, but not in the United States. There has never been a standard to make hate speech illegal.
In Canada, it is.
Yeah. The next question is for Matthew, and it's from Malika. I hope I said that correctly. What are some of the more creative, imaginative narratives you have heard from peers in your field that feel better suited for understanding the positioning of Native Americans in 2022, that go beyond the binary you mentioned of consistent oppressor resistor created from the marriage between French postmodernism and decolonialism, decolonial theory?
Yeah, that's tough because it's kind of asking for the antithesis to my argument, right? What are the books that are, despite what I said, well, there's got to be some good ones, right? And I'm sure there are. I'm thinking I like the genre of ethnogenesis because I feel like it's still sort of framed by colonization, but you're seeing something new produced. Craig Cibola was cited by Timothy's presentation. I know Craig Cibola a decade ago wrote a book on Brotherton Indians that I thought was really interesting in trying to say, look, there's this colonial structure that exists, but in that structure, we're getting some nuance and something new and something different. So I think maybe that genre of ethnogenesis, that's where I write also. My work's in that neighborhood of, something new that's stuck kind of pulling from this dichotomy, but trying to get at something new. Also, I think this idea of creativity is, I'm torn because I want creativity, I want new thoughts, I want new ideas, but I'm really scared by some of the outrageous creativity. Things that can be made up out of anything. I was reading over, is it Youngin's Elements of Style for Indigenous Scholarship, where he talks about how Native Americans, if you're biological, if you're a Native American, then you're entitled to a nationalistic, what does he call it? It's a national artistic license or something, where you can kind of just break the rules and do whatever you want. And that can be in matters of style, like you don't have to have a topic sentence at the beginning of your paragraph, and you don't have to have a flowing argument that makes any sense. Or it can be, can it be critical fabulation and making things up or whatever. So I worry a little bit about creativity, but I ultimately fall on the side of, well, I'd like to see more creativity, and let's discuss it and debate it, and hopefully we can have a conversation about which ideas stand up to rigor. But I don't have a list of books that I think are thoughtfully creative in a way that counters my argument.
Okay, there's another couple for you, Matt. One is from Bruce Gilley. The last you endorsed the virtues of post-colonialism, postmodernism, and decolonialization theory. But since these scholars are hostile to the very principles of a university, isn't this like allowing an overtly anti-democratic party to run in democratic elections?
Yeah, I think Francis kind of mentioned about the slide that postmodernism took, that when it started, as a way to, as just a criticism and not an overarching theory of all things. As a criticism, I think it works it's this extreme doubt, it's Descartes, it's doubt everything. And if you use it as a tool, and it's one tool in your box, and it kind of has its place and doesn't become the predominant theory that is of all things, I think that it can be useful. But yeah, I can see the argument that when it becomes all-inclusive, overarching theory of everything, well then yes, if there's no truth, how do you build anything? And it's chaos. And so I think we as academics have that responsibility to use it responsibly and to try to say, okay, I'm going to try this device, see if I find something new that I can then try and check and look at it in other ways maybe too. But I like it as one tool, but the problem is when it becomes the only tool.
And also, Bob Moranto asked whether there's a published version of your talk.
No, I stole a few parts of it from an article I did a year ago, but most of it's new.
Okay. Let's see. What else? So from Richard Hobby, the best defense is often to counterattack. How many of you are suing these entities stating that it is you who is being harassed, and suing them for millions of dollars, getting a law firm willing to do this aggressively? Once these institutions realize that they could wind up paying you millions of dollars, they may back off. Who would like to?
Oh, all of us?
In Canada, you have to go through your faculty association. So this is a big problem that has been mentioned by a number of professors in Canada. So right now, because of the unionized university environment, you need to take, your faculty association needs to take your case to arbitration. That's a big battle because sometimes unions have been captured by reified postmodernism or what's known as wokeism. You have members of the executives who don't want to do that. So you have to go through that route, and it's only when that route doesn't, then you appeal beyond that. You can take your faculty associations to the Labor Relations Board, but it's a bit more difficult in Canada, and you can't just go and sue your university. You have to get your faculty association to do it.
If you aren't already on the FIRE's mailing list, you should get on their list. They have a faculty list. They have a faculty conference coming up soon. They're paying for my lawsuit. They're the tip of the spear. They're doing the most. So,
I didn't really talk about my case because I didn't think we'd go that direction. But so I worked with FIRE originally. FIRE lent me to someone else, and we're trying to push back in a way we can. But the idea of getting millions of dollars is not something that's realistic at all. I don't think. Just the hope that we can stop the censorship and have an open discourse. I don't think our case, we've been going on for years now, and federal court is so behind schedule thanks to COVID. So we've done mediation once. We've got another mediation scheduled for December 5th, and the hope is that we can just get them to allow conversation on campus. Really, that's the goal. That, and I asked for transparency of finances, but they don't like my requests.
Okay.
Go
ahead.
I'm sorry. I decided to add that I dodged the bullet of being in academia. For the past 10 years, I've been Rhode Island state archaeologist, so I've been a bureaucrat basically. But I just took a new job a few weeks ago in the private sector for financial reasons mainly, a boring reason to leave a job. But in any case, so yeah, I'm not embroiled in any sort of huge controversy. No one's trying to destroy me. So, but yeah, it's again, I respect all of you in academia who are fighting the good fight there. The rules are stacked against you big time, and I'm with you in spirit that much.
Thank you. Another one from Bruce. Just this morning, Francis was highlighted on the state broadcaster CBC Halifax with Portia Clark by Sean Carlton, who tweeted that he spoke on, quote, why identifying and confronting residential school denialism, especially this week and day, can help honor survivors and put truth before reconciliation. Any comments, Francis?
Yeah, well, he's one of the major problems. Sean Carlton, Keisha Supernon, and Negan Sinclair, they both wrote pieces supposedly exposing the problems with denialism, but they really don't have any actual academic arguments. Either there's a kind of a misrepresentation or it's an ad hominem attack. The biggest one is what's called the Mott and Bailey type of fallacy that's used, which is where you kind of conflate two arguments, one which is kind of interesting and implausible, and the other one which is banal and true, and you switch those back and forth. And what happens with the unmarked graves, the so-called unmarked graves controversy, is that there are many unmarked graves in cemeteries because of cemeteries being abandoned and forgotten, and the crosses that were wooden being blown away. That's a completely different situation than clandestine burials, which are actually, burials which are graves which are illicit, which suggest some kind of foul play. Murder is often implied. And my area of expertise, which is the Kamloops case, which I really think all eyes should be on the Kamloops case, because the Kamloops case is the one that set everything off in May 2021 and is the most implausible of all the cases. And if we could just get the Beaulieu report, which was the GPR report, released, we could look at whether Beaulieu looked at the septic the digging for the septic field that went on there with the tiles, get that kind of examined, then we would have a bit of a way into all of these ridiculous claims that are being made. So You know, Carlton has just been absolutely terrible in terms of what he's doing. And he's just like, you know, I'm not sure if he's a true believer or a bad actor, but he never has anything of substance to offer in response.
The next question is for Tim. To what extent do you think that rational thought in a debate like this is besides the point, insofar as proponents of the less rational assertions explicitly understand these to be not quote unquote literal truths? That is, they seek a specific outcome by any means, including gaslighting. I recall a phrase from a few years back, lying for justice. And this was by David A. Karekin.
It's a very good question. And so the best answer I can give, and I'll give a couple more elements, is one thing I try to do in my book, as hard as I can, is I try to pull together the web of individual motivations that everyone has in these land challenges in alliance, virtue signaling, association with Native American representatives, and all that stuff. It's even more complicated than, it's as complicated as every individual involved. So it's difficult to talk about. But the people involved run the gamut from true believers who absolutely lose it when you challenge their delusion. I mean, I had a woman this summer, brought me out to show a site, and when I simply said, no, all the evidence points to farmers building these, I think you've misled local Native Americans, and now they believe you. This is a difficult situation. This person completely lost it, like shaking, angry, and I was like, okay, the conversation is over. So that's an example of a true believer. There are a lot of, they're without a doubt pragmatic people, and there are people who have stood behind these claims who literally just don't care, like pathologically unconcerned with society. They're just like, we just want to get to point B, and this is the way to do it. But as far as argumentation and having a reasonable discussion with most of the people who are very active in the movement, there is no reasonable discussion to be had. Some of the best example, I mean, it falls under sort of the broader umbrella of wokeism, but the last chapter of John McWhorter's Woke Racism can give you a really good overview of what do we actually do with these people. We have to coexist with these people. And one thing is, he says, stop trying to convert them. They're not going to be converted. And you got to have to work around these people. You're going to have to be fine with being insulted. You have to be fine with staring them in the eye and telling them you're absolutely wrong when they're telling you things that are completely wrong. But yeah, some of these people, there isn't a real discussion to be had whatsoever, and realizing that is going to make your life a lot more tolerable. I don't know, I just went on a rant, but anyways, that's what I got. It was a really good question.
Francis.
Satire. That's the only way you can deal with it. Satire.
I think humor is incredibly important to deal with all sorts of adversity, I believe. So, any other? I think we're out of time. We did not get to all the questions. There were quite a few. I'm hoping that there will be a way for me to save them and then send them forward to you in case you guys want to respond to them on another time. But I don't know if that's possible. But there were actually 24 questions and lots of comments and so forth. So definitely a lot of interest in this topic. And I thank NAS, of course, for holding this webinar and for making it possible when it wasn't possible in another manner. I also thank all four speakers, Francis, Tim, Stuart, and Matt, for excellent talks. And I look forward to reading much more about the different cases, and I wish everybody luck.
Thank you.